Hello, my name is Laurens Vandercruysse and I'm an assistant professor in economics at the Solvay Business School of the VUB. Today I'll be discussing the critical issue of data protection in smart cities, focusing specifically on the importance of incentive structuring in procurement processes. I actually did my PhD on data protection in smart cities, and if you ask an economist to think about the issue of data protection, our mind goes costs, stakeholders, and incentives. The research I'll be talking about today combines all those elements into a quantitative research design, but it's important to keep in mind that it comes on the back of a lot of more qualitative research, so mainly expert interviews with DPOs and public procurement officers active in the smart city domain. Some background. Public administrations are increasingly faced with wicked challenges. So challenges that cannot be tackled effectively within a single policy domain. Think environmental change, expanding populations, or growing inequality, for example. For local public administrations, transitioning towards becoming a smart city is often sketched as part of the solution in such a context. The smart city gathers and uses data, personal and non-personal data, to maximize public value creation. Why public value? Well, because we're moving beyond new public management's focus on efficiency and effectiveness, but also take, for example, social, sustainability, and data protection considerations into account. It's clear that these various factors might be in tension to one another when shaping the smart city transition. Moreover, we see that smart city services, or SCSs, often require public-private collaboration. First, because the public sector lacks the resources to develop their own SCSs, and second, in many cases there's just a clear complementarity of expertise between the public and private sector, and collaborating is just the more sensible way to go. Sizable public-private collaboration is in many cases funneled through formal public procurement processes. So public procurement is actually highly relevant for smart city services and thus also related data protection aspects. A bit of scoping. What are we talking about when we are referring to smart city services? My co-authors and I attempted to avoid a semantic discussion on the concept of the smart city and took a more granular approach by drilling down to the individual service level. The collective of smart city services in a certain environment could then constitute the smart city, or a smart city, but what the smart city is and what it is not is beyond the scope of this research. We define smart city services on the basis of 4 characteristics. First, there's a public interest dimension. Second, there's a physical element to the service, a physical presence in the public sphere. There's a personal data collection and use, and there are multiple stakeholders involved. The cameras placed in the city center, as on the slide, would fulfill all 4 characteristics, but the online portal of the city of Excel, for example, would not, because it lacks a physical presence component. Specifically, zooming in on these smart city services, we wanted to study data protection related ex-ante transaction costs borne by bidders in the context of SCS public procurement processes. That's quite a mouthful. Ex-ante transaction costs related to data protection can best be described as data protection expenses that are incurred by bidders in the process of compiling a bid for a certain tender. So that could include staff costs emerging from compiling a rudimentary data protection analysis of a data processing system, for example. It can be instructive to consider them data protection investments from the part of the bidder. When I'll be referring to data protection investments over the course of this presentation, I mean these ex-ante transaction costs related to data protection on the bidder side of a public procurement process. Now, why look at these costs or investments? Well, we start from the idea that data protection is a collaborative effort. For example, if we think about data protection by design and data protection impact assessments, it's clear that the supplier of hardware or software, even if they are not the data controller for the data processing operation, hold considerable and important information to effectively comply with GDPR obligations. Even when just a GDPR module is included in the tender, it's essentially an indication that there is an understanding that tenderers are relevant actors in ensuring data protection levels downstream. Concretely, we conducted an explorative econometric study of bidders' data protection investments with a special focus on the Benelux, France, and Germany. Our sample consists of 72 individuals SCS tender bids up to 2021. The sample is limited, and that should be noted as a caveat for undue generalization, but we mainly set out to test some of the intuitions from earlier qualitative research and to attempt to go beyond the more anecdotal evidence we'd collected through interviews and other stakeholder contacts. We wanted to focus on determinants of these data protection investments, as well as their competitive relevance. If we look at the sample of tenders we analyzed, we see that there's a good variety in financial value of tenders, ranging from below 50,000 euros to over €1 million. And we can also discern that smart city service tenders in our sample were mostly issued by public authorities at the local or the regional level. Beyond that, most of the tenders were quite competitive, with over 30% of tenders receiving more than 6 bids. Now, what did we learn from the analysis of our sample of tenders? Looking at determinants of data protection investments in the context of bids on SCS public procurement procedures, we see that the size of the investment is positively correlated with the strength of the relationship of the bidder with the tendering authority. If bidder and procurer have a stronger preceding relationship, this has a positive effect on investment levels. This finding underlies the importance of trust between partners in this context. Next, we also remark that these data protection investments are perceived as being larger as the level of outsourcing of data protection efforts increases. This could be the result of these external costs, for example, legal fees or technical consulting costs, being more consciously accounted for when compared to time spent by internal personnel on data protection related tasks. We also see that the data protection investments increase with the complexity of the Smart City Service project. This could be an indication that the risk-based approach of the GDPR, that is, more risky data processing activities warrant comparatively more extensive mitigation measures, is being adopted in practice. Next, we see that the relative size of data protection investments decreases as the financial value of the tender grows. This suggests certain economies of scale. Last, we see that the number of competitors for a certain SCS tender has no effect on the level of data protection investments. So more competition does not mean that bidders will increase their investments in data protection aspects of their bids. Turning to their competitive relevance, we see that the median size of the concerned data protection investments are at 5% of total tender value. We also see that these data protection investments lead to positive spillovers for bidders. Concretely, there's a positive correlation between the size of the investments and perceived boosts in internal capabilities and market reputation. This correlation is especially strong when a public procurement procedure is used that allows for inter-organizational data protection learning, such as the competitive dialogue. Finally, however, we see that there's no effect at all of the size of data protection investments on the probability that a bidder wins the Smart City Service tender. Basically, in our sample, the level of data protection investment is not of competitive significance in the public procurement context for Smart City services. Especially if we interpret this last point together with the fact that the level of competition for an SCS tender does not influence data protection investment, we get a somewhat better view as to what might be going on. There's a problem basically in the sense that data protection investments are not impacted by tougher competition, and the level of data protection investments has no effect on tender win probability. When we attempt to explain these dynamics, also based on the qualitative research from which this quantitative study emerged, we could deduce that bidders likely perceive that tender evaluations focus mostly, or even solely, on core functionality and price, and that they thus rightly derived that data protection investments are not a factor of significance in the award decision for SCS tenders. In practice, we often see that there's indeed late or non-involvement of DPOs, and our checkbox GDPR compliance measures are used in the sense that the bidder is expected to tick a box that the organization complies with GDPR, and that's it. Of course, it's evident that this is quite a detrimental situation for data protection levels in the smart city context. So how can we begin to rectify the situation and install an appropriate incentive structure for bidders to do their part? We argue that it is key that public sector buyers signal that data protection is taken seriously. What does that mean? First, early DPO involvement, and second, substantive broadening of tender evaluation criteria. With an eye on optimizing spillover benefits for bidders, further improving the incentive structure, it can be recommended to employ procurement procedures promoting inter-organizational learning. We often hear that competition will solve the issue of low data protection levels, but our research hints at the fact that we might need more than just more and tougher competition. The focus of this competition, the aspects which are perceived as and thus become part of a race to the top, matter. And the public sector has a responsibility to show that we're serious about data protection, and only then can competition be an effective lever for increasing data protection levels in the smart city. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to the Spectre project. The FWO-funded Smart City Privacy, Enhancing Collaborative Transparency in the Regulatory Ecosystem project investigated data protection in smart cities from the perspectives of law, communication sciences, and business economics. Our website contains a bunch of templates and insightful reports for practice, all of them for free, so please go and have a look. Among others, we have a tool for you to estimate the relative costs of DPIA's on smart city services, as you can see on this slide, but Tina Christofi at KU Leuven also wrote a very insightful piece on compounding data protection risks in the smart city that I can only highly recommend, most certainly in this dawning age of data spaces.